a little later on. I want to bring in now, well, a man who was there throughout all of the Fraser years and is still in the Parliament. Of course, I'm talking about the father of the House, Philip Ruddock. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Am I right in saying you came in 73? You came in a by-election 73. That's right. So you were there throughout the whole period of the
September 1973.
So tell us your memories of that time, because we've been talking a lot about today this decision to block supply, the dismissal, really framed so much of the early part of Malcolm Fraser's time as Prime Minister.
Well, let me contextualise my own engagement first. Having been Immigration Minister for 7.5 years, the aspect of Fraser that is most etched in my mind is the Australia of today, for which I believe he is very significantly responsible. And we are a country with something like 6 million Australians overseas born that has settled people from all over the world and done so extraordinarily successfully. And while some of this is a result of diversity in itself, much of it is because people have put in place programs in order to ensure that we do respect people of different races, different cultures, different religions when we bring them together as one people. And the establishment of organisations like SBS, putting in place programs that supported multicultural Australia. The way in which we have administered programs clearly from that time which are totally non-discriminatory in terms of race, religion, culture and like factors. The bringing of so many tens of thousands of Vietnamese to Australia as refugees and settling them in the way in which we have so successfully makes me very proud of Australia and the contribution that Malcolm Fraser played in developing a society that is an example to the rest of the world.
Philip Ruddock, I know few people who've done more than you in working with the multicultural community over many, many years. I mean, we've heard reflections today about the Fraser government and perhaps, you know, not doing enough on economic reform at the time, but you're really making the case here that what he did in relation to multiculturalism has really defined the Australia that we have today.
If you look at Australia from the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War from which we emerged, the way in which the Labor Party essentially abandoned its socialist roots. We have a very, very different political system that has emerged in my political lifetime, and I'm very proud of it. I think we can always do better, and I think if you look back at the time, Gough Whitlam was a friend, but he spent very generously on projects that people believed had their time due, but we went very significantly into debt. We had high levels of inflation, we had high levels of unemployment. I think better economic policies emerged starting under Fraser but continued under Hawke and Keating that were able to build the modern Australia. So I see it as a defining moment in our history, and I think we ought to recognise it very positively.
I think we've got an image, Philip Ruddock, of you and Malcolm Fraser that you tweeted today. This is back in 1981. The two of you there looking, well, pretty pleased about something, I'm not sure what, but the two of you there smiling to camera. And we should stress that the height difference isn't because you're particularly short, but Malcolm Fraser, of course, a particularly tall man.
Well, there is an interesting,
let me ask you...
there is an interesting story. He came to my home when we were living at Oatlands in Western Sydney, and it was in 1975. We were speaking at the Rosalie Community Centre to 1,000 people later on that evening, but he had dinner with the Ruddocks, and my daughter Kirsty, who has a profile of her own, looked at Mr. Fraser when she was 3 and she said, "Now, Mr. Fraser, you're a big man." And she looked at Tony Eggleton sitting beside him and said, "And you're a little man." And I guess she noticed his character, and it was not only in his height. He was a big man for Australia.
Now, your time as Immigration Minister in the Howard government, Malcolm Fraser was amongst those critical of the policies, the approach taken. I mean, how did that make you feel when you're talking about someone that you clearly have great respect for?
Well, let me just say, I think it is important to understand that even under Malcolm, we didn't have borders that were left unprotected. Measures were put in place to bring large numbers of Vietnamese to Australia through structured programs that brought people from Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong. We weren't terribly keen on getting boat arrivals, and I think sometimes Malcolm had a slightly selective memory of the way in which people were welcomed when they came by boat in the early 1970s, and the fact is that our approach of settling large numbers of people who had a need for protection was something that he did particularly well, and I think we have continued in terms of the policies that we have applied even today.
But did the wave of asylum seekers from Vietnam, was the treatment the same in terms of the length of detention, the type of detention? I mean, is this what his criticism was about? Well,
there were very many people returned to Vietnam from camps like Whitehead in Hong Kong, from Pilibhedong in Malaysia, from Galang in Indonesia. And Indonesia often felt that they were unjustly criticised for the way in which people were held. They were unwilling to open camps because they felt that people weren't necessarily as understanding of the difficulties in doing that when they had to provide sanctuary. So, you know, in relation to these things, I think that our desire to always handle these things in the very best and most humane way, we sometimes look back at the past and don't always recognise even the errors of the past.
Whether it was this issue or a combination of issues, he did ultimately part ways with the Liberal Party. Did you talk to him through that period, and how did you feel about that?
Look, Malcolm and I had periods in which we were particularly close, and other times in which he was perhaps even a little distant in relation to me. When I crossed the floor in 1988 on the race issue, he was one of the first to commend me for doing so. I think we had views in relation to what was happening in southern Africa, which were very similar. I look back at the way in which he played a leadership role in relation to those sorts of issues, and he was often before his time, and I think we ought to recognise that and be grateful that he was.
I'm interested to hear whether you agree or not with the characterisation we just heard from Greg Sheridan, that he was a man of deep contradiction, one of the most right-wing Prime Ministers that Australia has seen, but one of the most left-wing ex-Prime Ministers we've seen. Ross Cameron too, reflecting on these deep contradictions within Malcolm Fraser. Is that how you see the man, or do you see someone who did have a firm set of principles that didn't necessarily contradict each other?
Well, look, Ross and Greg are both friends, and I don't particularly want to be seen to be characterising their views as being substantially different to my own. But look, I think the characterisation of Fraser is because we took a strong position on economic issues, we're very critical of the Labor spending proposals, and in the end had to seek to deny supply, and the dismissal that followed, they characterised that as being of the right. But I remember Fraser of that time with views in relation to particularly Southern Africa, which I would regard as being liberal. I regard his willingness to be out there providing leadership in relation to settling large numbers of people from Vietnam at a time when others, even Bob Hawke, were critical of the numbers of people who were likely to enter Australia at that time through those sorts of programs. I think he was liberal, but has been characterised because of the economic issues as being something of the left. I don't necessarily see them as contradictions at all. I see them as being, to a large extent, following through on those principles. But as I've said, I think even when he was in office, there were approaches taken to unauthorised border arrivals, which go to issues of integrity. And I think if he thought about it more fully, he might have even recognised that the approach I took to integrity wasn't far from the approach he took himself.
And a final question, Philip Ruddock. Someone like Malcolm Fraser, with the views that we know he held in the end, what party do you think he would be most comfortable in today?
I think a Liberal Party. I'm sure you understand the subtlety of all of that.
Indeed. Well, I'm interested that you say that. Philip Ruddock, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon in your reflections on what is a sad day, obviously, for the wife and family of Malcolm Fraser and for people such as yourself who knew him for many, many years.
And let me just say of Tammy, she was a great First Lady for this country, a woman whom I was greatly proud, and to her and her family, the Ruddock condolences are very much with them, and we remember them in our prayers.
Thank you, Phil.